we're going to get started here in just a minute. And I think we're going to have a pretty relatively small intimate group here, so we can get sort of questions answered. We'll sort of make this much more of a conversation. Super excited to have Dr. Kevin Roberts join us today, who's got a bunch of familiarity with our work. So, we often find it's just helpful to have someone with the on-the-ground perspective to share. So, Kevin, really appreciate you joining us.
Absolutely, glad to be here.
It looks like, and I know we'll probably have a couple more folks sort of trickle in just based on sort of registration, but timing's always interesting. Kristen, Natasha, you mind just sort of coming up, just sharing a little bit of sort of a quick intro in your world, just to share a little bit about your background, sort of where you're from. Then we can just jump in. Sorry, Aaron, is everybody allowed to get off? No.
Yes, I'm getting them right now. Okay, you should be able to talk.
Natasha, Kristen, can you hear us? Okay.
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
Hello, my name is Dr. Natasha Pitt. I am the Director of Talent Acquisition and Development with College Achieve Public Schools. Have been conversing with Lauren and eager to hear more about the integration of BloomBoard here in New Jersey.
Love it. Super exciting.
Hi, my name is Kristen Maiello. I am a supervisor for Long Branch Public Schools. I work closely with Frank Riley, so he was the one who gave me the information about the webinar, and also excited to just get more information about everything and move forward with how we can develop our workforce here in Long Branch.
Love it. Well, really excited. So my name is Jason Lange. I'm the founder president for BloomBoard. So I lead a bunch of our state level work, a lot of our higher ed partnerships, certainly the work with Drew that we're super excited to launch here, that we can talk about in a bit. And I'm excited to sort of walk things through. Kevin, you mind just giving your intro real quick?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Roberts. I am Assistant Executive Director here at the Capital Area Intermediate Unit, which is just outside of our state capital of Harrisburg. Before that, I was a superintendent in one of our member school districts, the Big Spring School District, which is not too far from the Harrisburg region, about 2,500 students, where we were starting to explore this idea of partnering with BloomBoard to be able to offer different pathways toward teaching certification at the district level. When I moved here to the IU, we have expanded that thought process to make it more consortium-based. So excited to share a little bit about the roads that we've traveled to get where we are today.
And so why don't we do this? I'll give a sort of a quick background and sort of overview, and then, we'd love to have Kevin just share a little bit of some of the on the ground perspective about sort of what works, where are some of the challenges, what comes up in the process as we jump through this. So let me share my screen here. See my screen shortly? No. And so the quick background on us, so we've been around for about a little more than 14 years. Crazy that it's been that long. Really our work started out when I founded the company. The whole idea was, technology is going to change education in very meaningful ways. And so how can we use that technology to most help all kids in the process? And this idea of the ways that we're using technology historically to train teachers has been either non-existent or relatively poor. And so we really said, well, what if we could sort of start to create and use technology in a much better way to sort of change the way we give feedback to teachers, the way we train teachers, and the way we sort of advance teachers in the profession. And so as we've been building through and learning a ton on that over the past decade plus, really what started to happen is we've just now sort of collided with the teacher shortage. And we know the shortage is real, Para pools, sub pools are gone, We know that there's attrition levels are sort of at their highest rates that they've been in a long time, especially post-COVID, given everything going on. And more systemically, really, the problem is that we're just actually out of 20-year-olds now to staff the profession. And the ed prep enrollment is just as low as it's been and continuing to decline. I think the latest data showed that we were losing another 5,000 candidates this year in ed prep. And so even our biggest, largest marquee institutions are now dropping to numbers that are just really problematic in the single digits, tens of candidates. And so we're just no longer able to staff schools based on the historical pipeline of people in college going, ed prep programs. And what that then sort of questions is like, where do we go, right? That means if you overlap the ed prep enrollment and the attrition curves, in 2, 3, 4 years, things get pretty dire, and we end up in a very problematic space in terms of opening classrooms, opening schools for kids. And so the real sort of question, and where I think a lot of the impetus today is around where is that future pipeline, and how do we redesign the delivery models to really sort of encourage, right, sort of folks who are already in and around our communities to be able to get into fully certified teacher positions. And we've actually now surveyed thousands of paras, long-term subs, support professionals, educator support professionals, sort of folks in our classified staff roles. And it's typically 50 to 60% would like to be fully certified. And when we've now asked folks why, what's prevented them, it almost always comes up to sort of time, and in many ways, sort of even more importantly, cost. And what we find is, right, if you're an adult with a family, right, and you're not in the 20-year-old sort of college-bound system, but if you're now 25, 30, right, or you've been working in a school as a para for a few years, the reality of trying to go back and go get a degree is really, really hard, right? Effectively, it's sort of 2 full-time jobs that you have to take on, because you can't give up your full-time job, and you got to sort of, make money for your family. You probably have a family at home. And so then doing nights and weekends courses, even if they're online, is really sort of time consuming and painful, and it just makes it feel prohibitive. And so we've, systemically effectively locked people out of the profession that are in this adult sort of workforce that really are and could be amazing educators. And so a lot of the questions from the BloomBoard side, from our work, has said, well, what would it look like if you could almost wave a magic wand? And what if we could sort of wave a magic wand and sort of redesign the delivery model of higher ed to really specifically be built for this sort of adult learner population, for candidates, right, who are already working in schools, who've been employed by their districts for 3, 4, 5. We had Dr. One a couple of weeks ago who's been working in the district for 15 years. And had always wanted to be a fully certified teacher, who always wanted to get her own classroom, but just couldn't because of the time commitments, because of her family at home. And that if we could do that, and we could redesign that delivery specifically to these adult learners, to these sort of candidates in our communities, all of a sudden we could create a ton more equity and access into the profession, because there are hundreds of thousands of candidates that are interested. And most of our candidates in this sort of case actually match their student demographics, because they're from, right, the data on paras is most paras live within 12 miles of the high school they graduated from. And so there's a lot of really interesting ways to think about sort of how we use this as a way to help diversify the workforce in really interesting ways. And if we can sort of create these new degree programs as almost like a residency, right, a 2-year residency in a bachelor's degree, right? We know the residency data is really critical in terms of actually improving the quality of, right, instruction, and actually sort of improving retention rates. And then on top of it, there's just a whole bunch of net new funding in this sort of apprenticeship workforce, sort of funding realm that we can now use to help subsidize and pay for these degrees. And so vast majority of our candidates actually don't pay anything out of pocket. And so they're able to earn their degree on the job and, right, sort of not pay anything for it in the process. And that would really fundamentally change the pipeline in terms of who we're trying to serve. Any questions there, just from a high level standpoint? And so, Kevin, I'm just interested, just, as we sort of touch on this, like, can you give a little sense of sort of your cohorts and sort of what's that look like in terms of some of that? I know you all have surveyed folks, and I think we've seen pretty crazy numbers of people interested in the program. Can you give a little sense of sort of what you've seen there and sort of your groups?
Absolutely. So we started the process by surveying our staff to see who may be interested in pursuing this opportunity, and did they have any credits that they could apply to the program as they were looking to start. Very, very pleasantly surprised by a lot of information, some just the overall interest in that, many of the staff members that we already had in our pipeline didn't need to recruit additional ones. We're interested in pursuing the teaching degree if we could help them figure out the challenges with accessing the coursework, whether that be cost or just the ability to take the classes, and that most undergraduate courses or programs are positioned within the workday. So it's a challenge to do that. So a ton of interest. And also, a lot of our staff members that were paraprofessionals, we didn't know that they had already either attained an associate's degree or had a significant number of credits that they could apply to the program?
Yeah, I actually remember we have, so this is the initial survey data we did across the service. And so there's about 22, I think, districts in the capital area IU. And so it was sort of this crazy initial round of interest. So these are mostly rural, smaller districts in the middle of Pennsylvania. And we have 532 candidates across these 22 relatively rural, relatively small districts. So the interest in becoming a teacher, right, is really high. And that we know that there are candidates that are there, but we also know vast majority of those candidates just don't have the credit to actually move into and to get a bachelor's degree. And it feels overwhelming to try and go get 120 credits of a bachelor's degree, or to even get your associate's degree, because, right, to get a bachelor's from your associate's degree, because there's just that's a really long, right, sort of timeline, and trying to do those in sort of full time is just a lot. And so that's sort of the initial sort of candidate pool. I think what, from there, right, what we said is, well, what is the real crux of how we can change this model to open up that access? And so the way that we sort of think about it from the BloomBoard side is, imagine a world, right now, our teacher prep systems are pretty outdated, right? They've looked the same for decades. My teacher prep, I'm guessing any of y'all's teacher prep, basically came from a bunch of rooms that look like this, right? And now some of these are online, and you can do this, in a Zoom session, right? Or sort of in, nights and weekends and courses, but ultimately it's the content hasn't changed much, which is, right, you're learning. I joke, my professors, even at Stanford, it's a wonderful school, but like my old school professors used to play these videos from 30 years earlier, and they would pause the video periodically and say, all right, which student is in his or her zone of proximal development? And then we would debate ZPDs for an entire class session. And it was brutal. It was mind-numbing, and it was never going to make me a better teacher. It was never going to help my kids, but I paid thousands of dollars for that 3-credit course to go on a transcript, because that's the game. And that's just the rules of how it's played. And that just doesn't serve the populations and the folks that we need to serve now. And so what we've been really excited about, and obviously the partnership with Drew, we're super excited about, is we've now been able to sort of partner with some really innovative higher ed institutions and say, well, what if we could change that 3-credit course delivery? And what if instead we could take somebody in a parapro position, right, or in a sort of give them a co-teaching placement for a period a day. And in that co-teaching sort of assignment, what if we could actually give them time and space to do the work of co-teaching, of actually delivering instruction for kids, and then have them take their lesson plans and videotape themselves delivering those lesson plans, and take the student work coming out of those lesson plans, and use that sort of artifacts, use that portfolio of work that now they can upload into our system and get feedback from faculty on, so that we can use that portfolio to actually confer the same 3-credit course as if you were doing it in theory and sitting in rows in the sort of traditional model. And that's really the sort of the paradigm shift we've seen, is all of a sudden it's sort of designing the delivery and the approach of the learning model to really meet folks where they are in their jobs full time, and really sort of help them really understand, what does it mean to be a great teacher? And let's give you feedback day in and day out, week in and week out, over 2 years, to get you from associate to bachelor's, to earn that bachelor's in special ed in the process. So that bachelor's in elementary ed in the process. Any questions about that shift? Kevin, anything you'd add just in terms of your experience, or how you've seen sort of candidates so far sort of engage in that, sort of portfolio-based work?
Sure thing, Jason. I think the one thing that I would say from my perspective, either here at the intermediate unit or at the school district level, that I appreciated from a job embedded approach was, first and foremost, it gives a much higher degree of access to so many more candidates that don't have to choose between staying employed or pursuing the teaching degree. But beyond that, and thinking about it from the organizational level, let's say the worst possible scenario is that a candidate moves through the coursework and decides not to pursue a teaching degree. As an organization, we have just provided phenomenal professional learning and made one of our paraprofessionals so highly skilled and trained that it's essentially having another teacher in the classroom with a certified teacher. So it was a benefit even within the worst possible scenario of dedicating resources toward professional learning, which I don't see as a bad scenario whatsoever. But then the best possible scenario is, we have a teacher candidate that understands our system, that values our school district, that has been trained in the way in which we've endorsed, that becomes prepared to help take and lead a classroom in not a lot of time.
And I think it's really part of what we've seen, our completion retention rates, semester over semester, year over year, are 95+%. It's kind of crazy. And it really speaks to this idea of like the moment your job and your degree become the same experience, turns out you're going to do really well because there's a lot of incentive to make sure that you're sort of working through and doing the work, and you're just helping do your job a better way. And so we know a lot of obviously the intern programs are out there, a lot of the alt-cert pathways, the retention data there is not great, because often we hear candidates don't get feedback in the real life context that they need it. And this solves that problem in pretty amazing ways because it allows us to really integrate that directly into your actual job in the process. And what we've found is as we've now tried to sort of take that out to the field, take that to districts, it's a pretty big gap today in what it takes from a higher ed institution and sort of to not only sort of create an on-the-job delivery, but just even what we know about residency programs, right? That's a heavy lift in its own right. And then if you've tried to implement that residency, we know that all of the on-the-ground logistics of mentor placements and management and sort of support and interventions, that just is a huge gap right now in terms of how to sort of bridge that sort of gap for higher ed to sort of integrate it all the way down into an individual school's master schedule, into a sort of an actual day-to-day logistical, sort of calendar. And that's really the work that we, BloomBoard, are doing, is sort of filling that gap and trying to sort of map to all of those different sort of pieces that we know are needed. And that what that ultimately takes shape as is we've sort of built basically a learning management system. So our higher ed partners basically swap out Canvas or D2L, whatever they're using in their sort of traditional coursework, and they're using us, using BloomBoard platform as a learning management system for candidates and for faculty. And then we're taking those courses, and then we're building that residency management layer between our higher ed partners and our districts. And so we're coordinating, managing master schedules, coordinating sort of feedback for candidates, integrating into instructional rounds or whatever coaching capacity might exist in the process. And then we're aligning all of that to licensure, because we know you got to satisfy your student teaching requirements, you got to satisfy your field credit sort of hours, your coursework sort of requirements. And so we're making sure everything aligns even at that bachelor's degree level, and then ultimately helping districts get funding in the process. So we've been now writing, there's all of this new workforce funding available. So with DeKalb County in Georgia, we actually, got board approval for that contract and immediately started to set them up as an apprenticeship program in the sort of formal workforce board, Department of Labor context. And that even before we had ever recruited our first candidate, we had already gotten them $50,000 of new workforce dollars to help pay for their candidates in the program. And that there's just a lot of net new funding available. And so for all of our districts that we're standing up, we're sort of submitting these apprenticeship applications, going through incumbent worker, sort of funding streams, and trying to find where are the most dollars available to help subsidize these programs so that not only candidates don't have to pay anything out of pocket, but that we can subsidize the district's investment as well in the process. And as we do that, then we're now able to sort of create some really good sort of identification selection processes. So we're, as Kevin mentioned, we're sort of surveying candidates, understanding what their credit requirements are, what they have. We're sort of going through, we're doing principal surveys for principal recommendations and sort of helping principals sort of identify, Turns out almost all of your principals generally have a good sense of the folks who've already been in their buildings for a long time who would be great teachers. And so the idea that we can all of a sudden have a principal go to a para and say, hey, we've talked about this, about you becoming a teacher. Here's a great opportunity where we'll invest in and value you. And we're going to get you to be a fully certified teacher, and we're going to help you, and then we're going to get you to this great place from a economic, social mobility standpoint. That's a really powerful motivator in the process. And we have a bunch of systems to help manage that. And then ultimately, we're integrating all of that back around to sort of help make the system faster and more efficient. So we're trying to help with a lot of these gen ed course requirements. We're trying to sort of integrate it into the system to make it what's the fastest, most efficient, but also really high quality, rigorous way to actually train the future generation of teachers in the process. Any questions about that, just in terms of the BloomBoard world and sort of what we do and sort of how we help in the system? And so really what that ultimately now means is we're now seeing higher ed start to make this next generation sort of shift, which is really this idea of moving I think in the early days, pre-COVID, right, there was sort of this big shift from moving from in-person to online. And that was a big shift already for higher ed, right? And sort of moving courses into, right, virtual spaces and Zoom and asynchronous courses. And this is where we saw, Weston Governors and Grand Canyon and a bunch of these sort of universities explode in terms of enrollment. But I think what we've realized is that even online courses just aren't convenient enough for, right, sort of the candidate pools we're trying to serve. And that we know, right, we talk to candidates every day who say, like, I've wanted to be a teacher, but like I just couldn't do nights and weekends courses because it was too much to do at night, and I've got a family, I've got a second job. And so now what we're really seeing is this idea of, well, what if we could sort of take that next step into the next evolution and say, well, what if we could move from online to on the job delivery? And that's a really interesting way to start to create time and space and create some more scaffolds and integrate it into almost a job-based coaching experience that's really about how do we help you not only do your job really well, but get all the feedback and coaching and the sort of course structures you need to actually earn your degree as part of that process. And that's really what we're excited to launch with Drew, because now we can satisfy all the New Jersey licensure sort of requirements in the process. Kevin, I don't know if you've had experience with sort of that sort of evolution, or sort of how you've seen that play out in other sort of work that you all done. I know you've all have been doing a ton of work over the last several years to try and support your staff. I don't know if you've had any thoughts there.
Yeah, I would say, Jason, that really what's been important for us to come to grips with is at the onset, when we were deciding to move in this direction, to making the coursework more accessible by making it job embedded and partnering with, of course, with you and BloomBoard and our partners, our higher ed partners as well, was that it is a bit novel still. So what we've had to do was to work hard to put the pressure on some in-state partners to say, hey, it's here. This is the structure that our candidates want. You can be a part of the solution, but know that it's coming. And it's been interesting. You talked about this evolution as you have on this slide here. It's been interesting to see the evolution in the thought process and the intentional design now by some more traditionally minded universities and higher education partners to coming on board with this. So the wave is here. And certainly more and more partners are coming on board, and we have Pennsylvania seems to move slower than most states, but we have been very pleasantly surprised by some of our in-state partners that have come on board. Point Park, Messiah University, some of those that probably don't have as much name recognition in New Jersey, but mean a lot here. So I think the slide that you outline in the evolution of the thinking of delivery of the coursework is absolutely on point.
And then ultimately now, and I think this is where, from a field standpoint, from a teaching profession standpoint, it's pretty clear at this point that this is the way the future is going to evolve. And at the end of the day, we now have programs across, we have 4 new higher ed partners that we signed in March, which is kind of crazy. And so our world's a little insane right now. But right, what we know is we now have, right, programs, everything from high school, right, recent grads, high school dual credit sort of programs, right, all the way to sort of parapro, right, sort of programs. We have our Ohio partner launched a 0 to bachelor's in 3 years. That's an accelerated program for folks with 0 credits. We've obviously got associate to bachelor's degrees. That's sort of the sort of program with Drew that we're just launching in New Jersey. And then we've got, master's degrees, alt-cert pathways for MAT programs. We are working on that with Drew as well. And then we have a bunch of these high need certs. So the special ed add-on in New Jersey, we're just launching and piloting over the summer here. And so we'll be able to launch that for the fall. And that ultimately, at the end of the day, the future of the teaching profession is going to be one where if you want to do, I would argue, the greatest job, right, the most societal benefit you can do and become a teacher, right, you're going to be able to get that funded by someone else to pay for your degree. And you're going to be able to earn that degree during your workday on the job as part of the coaching program that's embedded in your actual work. And that's a super exciting way to sort of rebuild the talent pipeline, especially for the Gen Z perspective that wants a much more tangible, much more grounded, much more sort of mission purpose driven, sort of career prospect in its own right. And so we're also seeing that sort of pay really interesting dividends on the recruitment side as well. Any questions just about that overall structure, thoughts, comments, concerns? Natasha, yeah, please, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for all of this useful information. So my question is whether or not there is anything in the works, if you will, relative to assisting individuals with obtaining certification for ELL.
Yes, it's always, I mean, so we tend to find that these are the biggies, right? So we
Absolutely.
start off in bachelor's in elementary, bachelor's in special ed. We know that MATs is always sort of a big high need area, and then special ed and ELL. So absolutely, we're sort of working through it. I think we started off with special ed because we know that that tends to be where a little bit more of the liability exists. Certainly, we know that ELs are just continue to explode in terms of just numbers, and to try to help sort of build those needs and sort of processes. But yes, we will get that. We'll get that live as soon as we can.
Wonderful. Glad to hear that.
Kristen, sorry, you have a question?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, here in our district, we have been having some trouble finding science teachers, but more so at the high school level because their certifications are so specific. It's not just like a general science type of certification. So do you have anything geared towards that, like in the works or, currently?
Yeah, this is one of these sort of, it's probably a little longer timeline. We know the high school science and math. The problem here is actually the content exam infrastructure, and that there's not really a great way yet to sort of create time and space for someone to get that outside content, right, as part of their sort of programs. And it actually requires some retooling of the logistics. So we have some district partners who've already said, we know that we're not going to find, unless you can find somebody with a bachelor's in math, the likelihood is they can probably make more money elsewhere. And so it's going to be really hard to recruit those folks from out of field. Maybe we have some retirees, but we've already started having conversations to say, well, what would it look like if you could take a para, put them into a high school math department, and actually have them learn a bunch of that content while they're earning their degree so that they can then pass their exams. But that's a new role and a new, sort of assignment doesn't really exist in most high schools today. And so it's been a little bit more sort of incumbent on districts trying to innovate and sort of create space for candidates to earn and learn that content area. Because to your point, right, the specificity on the licensure, it's not necessarily the degrees we can build, but it's the content exam barriers that are going to be the real problem. They're already the real problem there. And so we need a little bit more sort of help on the district side to figure out how best to sort of build that content capacity. And again, I think as we sort of continue to evolve here, we're going to see more ways to sort of help with that, and try and figure out sort of ways to sort of use, whether it's AI, whether it's other tools to help manage that process more efficiently. Any other questions or other thoughts, comments on the structure? And so really the idea here is, right, we're sort of taking this structure, and I can share, I always find it sort of helpful to sort of go through, and I can share this as just a little bit about, like, we call it sort of our apprenticeship white paper of sorts. But really what we've done is the teacher apprenticeship world has gotten all sorts of press, and right, there's all sorts of folks out there sort of helping. We write apprenticeship applications for our districts just as part of our program. So we don't charge for it, right? The idea is, right, we know it's valuable, but it is a set of paperwork, and we can scale the paperwork. The reporting is painful, but we also have all the tools to manage that. And so we're writing apprenticeship. We're a sponsor for our districts in a whole bunch of states, in Illinois, in Ohio, in Georgia. We're soon to file one with capital area and folks in Pennsylvania, Louisiana, other folks. So we're sort of constantly writing apprenticeship applications and sort of standing these programs up. And this little white paper sort of covers really some of this, like the research on why we have some pretty systemic barriers to equity and access in the profession. And that's been pretty well documented in the research. And frankly, why the future of ed prep is going to have to come from this sort of grow your own model. Right? And we just can no longer rely on the ed prep pools because they're just not big enough to actually staff schools. And then it's going to be incumbent on districts to build their own talent. This is the corporate world too, right? And if you're not building your own talent these days, right, you're going to get caught. And that's a very clear, right? The data is just very clear there. And so the idea is, right, we sort of tried to sort of package this up into a little bit of a sort of summary, but then there's also in this doc a little bit of basically like a program scoping, a sample overview. And the thing that I always find so helpful is if you think about this model, right, in the traditional 3-credit course structure, right, credit hours feel a little amorphous, right? It's not clear. You take a 3-credit course and you're not sure what the credit is aligned to in any real way because it's a credit hour and it's just time. And that what we've now been able to do, and this is really the crux of that sort of shift into portfolio-based learning is, right, we've really sort of been able to redesign that 3-credit course model to be a 3-portfolio sort of course model. And so every one of these names, these units here, is what you would imagine to be an actual portfolio of real life interactions between candidates, right, teachers and their students. And so as you can imagine, right, every candidate, so we're taking a 60-credit associate to bachelor's degree program, and we're changing that into a 60 portfolio associate to bachelor's degree program. So your candidates, right, our candidates get feedback one-on-one, annotated, time-stamped on real life work with kids for every single one of these names, numbers here. And that's part of what we're really excited about is because as you can imagine, right, this is a ton better feedback than I ever got in any student teaching experience that I went through, right, or any education course I ever had. But it's really grounded in the day-to-day life of what it means to be a great teacher. And that's what we're really excited about is all of a sudden it means every day, day in and day out, we can start to really have conversations with candidates about what does it mean to promote student agency, right? What does it mean to sort of get into, right, some of the special populations and sort of motivation in the programs, right? How do you really do that in a tangible, real life way with kids in real classrooms in the process? Any questions just about that structure and sort of how that's played out? And then ultimately the idea is, right, we're sort of taking that model and then really sort of empowering districts to own it. And I think this is one of these big shifts, whereas, you know, the moment we start to create these on-the-job degrees, really then it becomes incumbent on saying, well, really the owner of that sort of world is really the employer. It's really the district. And so this becomes sort of a way for districts, you know, frankly, right now, the reason we're in such a big shortage is that Amazon and Target are competing away, right? Starbucks, right? I talked to a district the other couple of months ago that lost a special ed para to a Buc-ee's. That's like soul crushing. Like, how are we losing special ed paras to fast food chains? But she said, look, they're going to buy me a bachelor's degree and put me on a management track. And I got to take care of my family. And so we have to fight back. And these are the sorts of tools that we're creating to fight back is how do we then give districts the ability to create these pathways, brand them how they want, make them employer centric and employer driven. And, you know, we always joke like, I'm completely happy if nobody ever knows that BloomBoard even exists, right? Because it's not a BloomBoard degree, right? And it's a university degree and an employer district. And that's where the real magic happens is that districts can embed these degrees into their advancement, into their HR systems, make them sort of very clear and sort of create messaging that we're investing in valuing our community and that's the real power behind sort of the next generation of recruitment. Because the more you can make that message, and Kevin, I'd love for you to sort of just share what you all have done with this sort of capped idea, because I think it's really interesting and obviously it's been pretty helpful and some of the press you all have gotten has been pretty amazing. But it'd be sort of helpful if you sort of just share this idea of like, you know, capped or sort of the districts becoming employers of choice. I think it'd be super helpful for folks to hear.
Absolutely. So yeah, definitely from an employer choice standpoint, we've framed our program as capped, capital area pathways to teaching. And what we've tried to map out is there are multiple pathways to success, this, you know, being one of them, a job embedded opportunity to earn credits being one of them toward teacher certification. What has been very interesting for me to come to grips with, and here's a shift in my thinking from the district level to where I am now, is as a superintendent, when I heard this idea, my mind went immediately to, if we're going to skim off the top of our paraprofessional pool to create teachers, it's kind of like the cartoon where you push the lump in this side of your head and it sticks out that side. The lump is still there. We still have the problem of a staffing shortage somewhere. What I have, where I've grown and what I've become very impressed with is our ability to leverage this as a recruiting tool. So we have not seen what I feared that we may see. In fact, it's quite the opposite, that when we go out to try to recruit aspiring teachers or paraprofessionals, this is a tremendous recruiting tool where we can say, like your Bucky's example of that employee before, Jason, we can say, hey, we will pay for you to get a bachelor's degree. We're hiring you as a paraprofessional. We will help you become a teacher at no cost to you. And, even beyond that, if you want to pursue administration or something else, there are pathways for that as well. So it has become a tremendous marketing tool for us. And as a service agency that supports 24 school districts around us, we actually have to be kind of careful with how we market it so that we keep those school districts as partners, and to help them do the same. So we're trying to market that in tandem with them so that we can all benefit equally. But the benefit of utilizing the program as a recruiting tool is very real.
We actually just ran a pilot with a third-party sort of call center operation. So one of our districts partnered with this third-party call center. We gave them sort of a script to start recruiting from, and this is a K-8 sort of district of only 2,500 kids. So relatively small K-8. They went out and we looked at 500 candidates that had graduated from 8th grade who were now in the sort of postgraduate, post-college graduate sort of age in their 20s. And out of the 500 candidates, we had 25 sign up to express interest in the program, which is sort of crazy given the numbers and given that conversion rate of there's just a lot of folks, right, living at home right now that would love to be teachers and think of teaching would be a great profession, but just feel like they didn't even know it's a real option. And they're trying to figure out, well, what do I do if I go work in retail, if I go work somewhere else? But we know that there's actually a bunch of, pent up interest there. It's just about how we market to it, how we sort of share about it, how do we sort of share and create this new narrative in our communities that we're really elevating the profession. We have we do these signing ceremonies that are like my favorite places on earth. Because there's just we're sort of having our candidates have signed contracts at board meetings, and people bring their families, it's a really heartwarming, it's not a dry eye in the house, because people sort of say, look, I wrote this off, I thought I was never going to get a degree. I thought it was never possible. Now my employer, my district is investing and valuing me. And I get this really amazing opportunity in life to do great work that I've always wanted to do. And that we even have a superintendent in Texas who they're planning on doing their next signing ceremony in hot air balloons because they're elevating the profession. And she would say, I don't have a teacher shortage because there's so many people, that the news shows up on their campus and does these videos of, how they're doing it. And sort of shows how they're sort of investing in their staff, and they've got hundreds of people on their wait list. And so we've now started to have some of our districts create wait lists for candidates, because now they can look 2-3 years out and say, I see exactly how I'm going to get to 0 vacancies, because I now basically am owning my own candidate pool, and I can see exactly when my retirements happen. I've got already existing pool of graduates who are going to come through and can sort of fill those roles and meet the needs of my kids. Any questions about that structure, thoughts, comments? And so I know we're running sort of short on time here, so I want to sort of, just to sort of tie this up, I think the last set of stuff that we would sort of talk about is really, how do we try and make this work? And that we know, this is real lift, There's no sort of simple way to redesign the teacher pipeline. And so what we've done is really tried to build a lot of the systems and processes on the BloomBoard side to sort of help in that world. And so we've got a pretty clear sense now doing this across hundreds of districts in the country. And we're trying to launch with New York City in the fall for, some crazy amount. We've got a whole bunch of very large districts and all the way down to very tiny rural districts. And so we have a bunch moving. And really the idea is, how do we sort of build the processes and the systems so that districts don't have to have and create a ton of extra capacity internally, A lot of this work, we know what the research about residencies looks like in terms of how to help engage. We know what the data looks like in terms of recruitment and messaging and sort of all the sort of ways to win that narrative in the community. And then we know how to manage that applicant implementation, how to get them through FAFSA, how to get them through the registrar's office at Drew, Those are the systems that we're building to just make it a much more efficient process. And then ultimately, as we get candidates through, we're also building some pretty amazing systems to actually help celebrate and build that sort of new narrative. And so that's a really sort of a fairly sort of quick overview, just sort of how we think about the implementation plan. But really the goal is we're trying to take on that capacity lift because we know, there isn't an HR department in the country right now that's sort of sitting around with a ton of extra capacity to manage, sort of these pipelines. And therefore, right, we've got to build those systems and build those processes. Unfortunately, we have really great technology that can help manage it and help support it and help sort of manage that process. And so I just want to give sort of a quick overview. I guess we can turn it over to some Q&A. Kevin, I'd be interested in just as you sort of have thought about this implementation model and sort of where, I'm always interested, like, how have you thought about sort of what's worked really well, what's been surprised, what has come up in terms of the implementation that's been harder than you thought? And what would be helpful if you were, sitting as a soup or sitting as a, HR director right now, trying to evaluate this, what would be sort of the most sort of important questions you'd be thinking through?
Absolutely. So like digging into some of the logistics, and I'll, Natasha and Kristen, any questions that you have about specifics, I would be more than happy to respond to those, but kind of just thinking about some things that come into mind. There were a few slides back, Jason had mapped out how BloomBoard sits as essentially the learning management system of the college or university. And I think that was a critical understanding that I needed to arrive at, in that, some of the criticisms of programs that come up that appear to make it more accessible for students to access the coursework. Some of the criticisms may be that we're reducing the rigor of the coursework. What I've learned is the coursework is the coursework. So for us, one of our local partners for the MAT program is Messiah. And we use Point Park for our TAP program, Point Park University. It's their coursework. It's their curriculum. What BloomBoard does extremely well is works with the IHE and brings that curriculum into their learning management system in a portfolio-based avenue so that it's more accessible for the students. So rigor to me became something that was a non-discussion because of it being one is the same as the other. What is a logistical item to be mindful of that I would say is the candidates in this structure need to be able to access classrooms where they can gather the artifacts that are appropriate for the courseware. So if there's a course for applying the science of reading, let's say it's a paraprofessional, that paraprofessional needs to be able to access a classroom where they can gather those experiences and artifacts. Doesn't necessarily mean they need to be in there full time, but they need to be able to access that experience for that course. And then, another course is, students addressing special populations. So that same candidate may then need to move over to another classroom for the next class to be able to gather those experiences. So what we've helped to shape or mentor some of our school districts around are building structure. Exactly, Jason, great slide there. Building structures to support the flexibility of candidates accessing the classroom. So Jason, I'm going to pause because that slide says more than I possibly can.
Totally. And so this is a little bit in that, like the sort of brass tacks of implementation, which is, again, so think about if now each of these courses, so let's say we're going from associate to bachelor's. And so in order to do that, that's 60 credits, right? And it's 20 courses. So this is just a sample. Obviously, there's a Drew specific version of this that we can share and sort of get into the implementation timelines. But the mental model is to say, okay, if we've now mapped out the 20 courses, and we know right now they're built into our LMS, right? They're sort of mapped against what the sort of the course requirements are. We already know some of those courses, the white ones here, these are courses that don't actually require students in classrooms, right? It's lesson planning, right? Special Pops, which is a bunch of IEP legal rights are working there. So we know that there's some courses where you don't need access to kids. The yellow courses in this case are gen ed classroom access. So in that case, we know they're more pedagogical, classroom management, any classroom you can push into or co-teaching, you can sort of actually have and complete those artifacts. And then there are these pink courses that are really subject specific, right? You're still going to have to do your math methods course. And therefore, in order to complete your math methods course, you need access to a math classroom. And so part of the idea behind the residency approach is we're mapping all that out long ahead of time. And we're saying, okay, here's a 2-year program to get through all 60 credits in a cohort mapped against the school year, not only your own school year, but also the university's calendar, right, semester term sort of structure. And then what we're doing is working at the district level to say, okay, how do we get 1 period, 1 hour a day in a placement for candidates to have access to this classroom? And that's where I think, sort of Kevin mentioned, sort of the logistical creativity is abound. And so what we've often seen, right, is sort of using these sort of release schedules and sort of different models to say, okay, well, what if I have, right, sort of one of my paras working, even if they're in a special ed para role, they're working in their normal one-to-one special ed para duties for most of the day, but they get one period already baked into the master schedule. They get one period of release to jump into their residency, into their actual sort of co-teaching placement, where they're in that math classroom or they're in that gen ed classroom, and they're going through, and in that time, that's when they're working on their portfolio, they're teaching, they're capturing the artifacts, and then they might be doing some things, sort of on their own time outside of that window or in planning time, or, sort of might be nights and weekends that they're sort of uploading and sort of reflecting on things. But the idea is that they're not doing the sort of the 3-hour nights and weekends courses and sort of, delivery. They're able to embed the time and the work that they're doing directly into their actual workday as part of their actual sort of schedule. And that's the really powerful. So we have folks doing this in tutoring models and different, sort of Montessori co-teaching placement sort of structures. So it really just depends on the model and depends on the district. But that's what our partnerships team is really sort of working with our districts on, is say, what flexibility, what's your current scheduling process look like? And how do we create the time and space for those candidates to be successful, to get through the amount of coursework they need to on time, on schedule, and graduate in a very reasonable sort of process in the work. Questions about that logistical lift? Go ahead, Kristen. What else would be helpful as you sort of think about sort of, next steps or processes sort of as we sort of go through this? Any other questions as we think about sort of where we are? Kevin, any last thoughts that you'd share that would be helpful for, again, sort of folks sitting in the sort of the before getting started idea?
Absolutely. I would say the one thing that would have been beneficial for me to hear at the onset is maybe some of the data around it. So our organization, we've had just shy of 80 candidates enter into one of the programs, whether it be, associates to bachelor's, bachelor's to master's to date. And we cast our net widely. Jason had talked about, some strategic recruiting, and we're learning over time how to recruit better. We being our organization, how to recruit better into the program. But we cast the net widely. We said kind of come one, come all. And out of the almost 80 students, we've only had 2 that we've really had to work with around academic concerns. And I think that speaks to not only the retention rate across the board with this structure, but also the level of support that's thought about. I will say there are certain structures that we put in place as a result of BloomBoard's guidance. I would say the mentoring structure is one of those specifically, that, every candidate that moves through the program has a dedicated mentor that helps them navigate gathering the artifacts and reflecting on the evidence that they've gained. That has been, based on the information we've received back from the candidates, one of the most beneficial pieces that contribute to the success of the candidate. And I can say from my school district lens, that's the same thing that I would have said for new teachers with orientation and induction, that partnering them with a great mentor teacher is the difference maker, and it is with this program as well. So my brief summary to that bit of information would be, early on within our first year, we've seen a high degree of success in the way of retention, and a lot of that is by design with some of the requirements that are in place there with BloomBoard.
Love it. Appreciate it. Yeah. And obviously that's something we're laser focused on, and we're only sort of continuing down the path when it gets into the test prep work, right? And exam prep, and making sure we've got sort of candidates who can be successful, not only from an instructional standpoint, from a content, from an exam practice standpoint. So unless there are other questions, again, really want to thank you both for joining us, right? This has been super helpful. Hopefully it's been helpful. I know we've got folks that are going to be watching the recording here as well. So we'll certainly share that back out. And then we can share out the PowerPoint, share out that little research brief as well. But really thank you for your time. And we're super excited about where all this is headed in New Jersey. And we know we've got a whole bunch moving. So thanks for all the effort and all the time. And Kevin, really appreciate the sort of support and the time and your contribution. This has been super helpful. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for all of that. Thank you.
Take care, all.